Welcome. My name is James Christian Blockwood, and I'm Executive Vice President at the Partnership for Public Service. It's a pleasure for me to be here today to facilitate this conversation with Richard Clarke, an individual whose expertise and experience is matched by almost no one when it comes to the Middle East and all implications around the future. So thank you for having me here and welcome.
James, good to be with you.
All right. The Middle East region has seen a milestone in the recent departure of U.S. military forces in Afghanistan. How do you believe that might shape the rest of the region now and in the future?
Well, before I answer that specific question, a warning. Predictions are really hard to do beyond maybe 24 months. I had the Secretary of State that I was working for once back in the dark ages, and he asked for a prediction of what something would look like 10 years out. And I thought we couldn't do that. But since a Secretary of State is asking you, you do it. But before we did it, I asked my team to think about what did people predict 5 years ago? What did people predict 10 years ago? And we had never done that. This was in the State Department Intelligence and Research Bureau. And we'd been predicting things for decades, but no one had ever gone back and looked at what our track record was. And it was abysmal. And I say that, at the top of this conference on the future, just as a warning in general, that we're not very good as human beings seeing beyond maybe 24 months. In our personal lives, in our organizational lives, or as analysts. We can identify trends, we can identify technologies, but we get it wrong most of the time. And so the value of these futures conversations is for us to do kind of sensitivity analysis on, what do we know? And what do we think that could lead to, realizing that there are lots of different futures it could lead to. We just have to know what the factors are, and that's important, that's helpful. It also tells us what to track as we watch our predictions fall apart. But having said that, that gave me time to think about the answer to your question.
I see.
I think the immediate aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal, because it was such a messy withdrawal and badly implemented, is that it has shaken, obviously, confidence in the United States. I don't think that will last. I know it's not advisable to reason by analogy with other historical precedents, but let's try, at least, to remember, and I'm old enough to remember, the fall of Saigon. And the predictions then were what we call the domino effect at the time, that South Vietnam would fall, and next it would be Thailand, and then Malaysia, and the Philippines, and Indonesia. And before we turned around, the entire Southeast Asia would be communist. None of that happened. None of that happened. And the reason why, I think, is the United States may get some things wrong, particularly when we do military interventions on a large scale. But at the end of the day, we have enormous strength. And I've talked to leaders in the Middle East who say to me, what language are we talking? English, why? Oh, so we're not talking Chinese. That's because I don't know Chinese. You don't know Chinese. The conversation went on like this. Where did I send my kids to college? Was it Beijing? Oh no, it was Boston, wasn't it? Yeah. Where do I send my family when they have health problems? Is it Shanghai? No, it's Cleveland, it's Baltimore. So I think at the end of the day, well, we tend to look at America often through the prism of its military power and its misuse of that. we have a lot of other power and a lot of other influence that no one's going to match in the near term. So I think, sure, China is going to have a greater role in the Middle East than it has had. Russia is certainly trying in the last decade to have more than it had. But the United States is still the dominant world power, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. And when Middle Eastern countries think about relations with powers outside of the region, they think about America first.
Right. Now, I spent the balance of my career prior to my current role in government. I was a senior executive, primarily working in national security and foreign affairs. I also did some work in strategic foresight. And I agree with you. Prediction is not something that you would want to aim towards. In fact, you want to look at a range of plausible outcomes and then hopefully pursue one that's preferable, at least try to influence in that direction.
Right.
You mentioned trends and monitoring them. Can I ask you to maybe share, and we'll get more specific into specific trends, but can you share the broad trends we should be tracking and monitoring given the withdrawal recently from the US? And then can you also give us a sense of what would be a preferable outcome or scenario for the US and for the Middle East? And those may not be mutually exclusive.
Yeah, so I think when we look at the Middle East right now, it's changing faster than it has in memory. And that's not just true of the Middle East. I think it's true globally that the rate of change, societal change, technological change, is accelerating. And that's going to be true going forward, that technology builds on itself. We got a vaccination for COVID-19 really quickly because we had already done the work on mRNA technologies and all of that. So things are moving faster. And when I think about the Middle East and ask myself, what trends should I follow? I think first, fundamentally, it's the penetration of technology into the societies. Mm-hmm. If the societies have access, generally, to the internet and internet-related technologies, that's going to change the country enormously. It's happened, obviously, in the Gulf states, the city-states, but then there are places like Yemen where it might as well never have existed. So I think we need to follow the growth of technology, the adoption of technology, and the native development of technology. Our apps being developed there, our Middle East citizens becoming the people who are running the servers and running the companies. Is it going to be indigenous? And the answer is already it is. It's already indigenous. It's not just something where people from the outside come in. And I think if you see that technology accelerating as it has been, that's the fundamental thing that changes the politics, it changes the economics, it changes the security equation. It's all about adoption of technology and adoption inherently, having the people of the region own it and run with it.
Yes. No, I agree with you on that. And, about 10 years ago, we saw the Arab Spring, and some could argue that technology played a major role in that. As you look out in the next 10 years, you've already answered a little bit of this, but maybe you could go a little deeper on how do you see technology really shaping the region, and how do you see the United States, and what role do you see the United States playing in that?
So the United States is still the technological leader in the world. And I don't mean to sound jingoistic here, but if you look at the leading technology companies in the world, on any metric, if you pick the 100 leading technology companies, 99% of them are probably in the US. Now, the Chinese number is going up a lot, but still innovation comes out of the United States. And it's Silicon Valley that's still powering, I say that in the broader sense of Silicon Valley, and still powering the technological change. And so people are still going to be dealing with American companies, coming to American universities, interacting with American private equity and venture capital firms when it comes to technology. How is it going to further change the Middle East? I think to the extent it can create industry in the Middle East that will employ people, that's where I look. I know people tend to think that technology throws people out of work. But you know that's not true.
Right.
It just shifts the jobs, right? And there's been massive unemployment in several Middle Eastern countries, particularly among youth. And now among educated youth. People are graduating from colleges in the Middle East and don't have any place to go that challenges their skills or utilizes their talents fully. To the extent that technology companies pop up in the Middle East, or companies utilizing new technology pop up in the Middle East and can employ people in industries other than extraction, other than oil and gas, and particularly employ women. There's a huge labor force there that's untapped and that's highly skilled. And in most Middle Eastern countries, women are outperforming men scholastically, not just at the secondary school level, but also at the university level. And so there's a great pool of talent. If that pool of talent can find technology-related jobs in the Middle East, that changes the society. If people have good jobs and they're invested in that economy, they're invested in that society, it produces stability and it produces interaction with the rest of the world. So I know several Middle Eastern leaders and governments are trying to do that, trying to bring technology in and make it native and change first their education system, then their economy, and then their political, social economy.
All right. So, let me shift our focus to another trend, one that I think you have a good background in, climate change. The Middle East region, just due to geography and a number of other factors, is vulnerable to climate change.
Yeah.
What do you think the impact will be on the Middle East in general? And that can be across the range of social issues, technological issues, et cetera.
Yeah, this is obvious to say, and I'm sure lots of people are going to say it this week at our conference. Climate change is the number one determinant of our future globally, but particularly in the Middle East. The Middle East is more sensitive to climate change than any other region. It's a very fragile system in most of the Middle East. It's very dependent on rivers that are drying up. And I'd argue the Middle East has already suffered from climate change. On a geological time line. But if you look at Libya, for example, it's largely the Sahara Desert, and there's not much you can do with it. But that was a garden, on geological time. Most of the Middle East has already experienced desertification, which now is other places are going to be experiencing and already are. But there is still room in the Middle East for the desert to expand. And it is, unfortunately. And water sources are drying up. And people are not switching rapidly enough to desalinization. And even when they do, particularly in the Arab Gulf, that causes environmental problems too. So if we go forward in our minds 10 years, and if we look at the COP predictions about where climate will be, it's very scary for the Middle East. Already now, you can't really go outside in many Gulf cities in the summertime, and the summertime's expanded. and we're seeing temperatures of 140 degrees Fahrenheit. That used to be an anomaly, and now it's every summer. You can't live under those circumstances. People who have the means are actually fleeing every summer. So their home country tends to be a part-time place. They have to leave it because it's just uninhabitable during the summer. And things that are outside, equipment, whether it's streets or lights or electricity, or in Dubai, the metro system, all of that gets damaged under those temperatures. Nothing is designed to operate under those temperatures. And we hear people laughingly talking about putting these cities under bubbles, giant Buckminster Fuller spheres. And that used to be a joke. I don't think it's a joke anymore.
All right.
If we want to maintain life going forward in those wonderful cities that have been built in the last 20 years, we're going to have to put a lot of it under some sort of cover. Because one thing I think we do know is where we are environmentally today is not going to get better. We're not in the foreseeable future going to move backwards in time environmentally. More likely it's going to get worse. And all the predictions, and this is the thing that people really need to understand about climate change. I started this conversation together with you talking about how predictions have always been wrong in the past and how you have to go back and look at predictions. Predictions in the last 20 years about climate change have always been wrong. They've always been too cautious. And therefore, every 2 years, the UN Climate Change Organization is revising its estimates. And something that they used to say would happen 50 years in the future is now 20 years in the future. And that's a temperature rise and it's sea level rise.
Absolutely. We've talked a little bit about the emergence of technology and the impact that might have on the Middle East. We've talked at length about climate change. In addressing either of those issues, strong leadership is going to be needed.
Yeah.
Both Iran and Israel have new heads of state, and we would be curious of your thoughts on how they may be consistent with prior heads of state or inconsistent with prior heads of state, and what are some of the opportunities that these new heads of state have going forward for the region?
Well, I think that's one thing where I know I'm always wrong, is when a new leader comes in making predictions about that new leader. Frequently, I'm pleasantly surprised, but I don't think we know how either leader will deal. If you look at the information we have today, you would say the new leader in Israel, the new leader in Iran have much less clout than the people they replaced. Sure, because the people they replaced were there for decades. So I don't think we know. But I think you put your finger on something by talking about strong leadership. To deal with the climate change problem and to make the kind of profound societal changes that are necessary to get women involved in the economy and to change the educational system so that you can have non-oil industries. That takes strong leadership. It happens in countries where there is strong leadership, and that doesn't mean one person. It means a cadre of experts and a consensus among the leaders of the country. But it takes strong leadership. You can't dilly-dally. The rate of change is accelerating, and that means those who dilly-dally, those who don't make decisions, those who don't implement change are going to be left behind.
Yes. Your ideas and thoughts towards an inclusive economy make perfect sense, particularly in our global environment today. But in order to achieve that, you need regional stability.
Yeah.
You need global stability, quite frankly. Can you talk a little bit about the geopolitics of the region, the relationships, particularly with the U.S., with the region, or amongst each other in different countries, and what you think those implications are?
Well, I said a minute ago that the Middle East was a particularly vulnerable and fragile region environmentally. And you're going to think that I think the Middle East is always special and unique, because I'm about to say the Middle East is also the Middle East is also perhaps the most security threatened region of the world. I know there are massive security problems elsewhere, particularly in Africa, but the Middle East has almost for the last 50 years been the focal point for civil wars, wars of nations against each other, some very large, some more regionally, and that hasn't changed. Particular wars get over. Every war must end, Freddie Clay wrote years ago. But the phenomenon of civil wars, some of them endemic, and the phenomenon of tensions between nations doesn't seem to change. In the last few, I hesitate to say this, in the last few weeks and months, we've seen a little glimmer. We've seen Qatar and some of the other regional states like the Saudis and the Emiratis, who were almost at dagger's point a few years back, getting together and working out their differences, at least some of them. We're seeing efforts to reach out to Turkey and Turkey and Egypt, which were almost at dagger point, talking, seeing if they can work things out. Some people, some commentators are suggesting this is because of the U.S. Pulling out of Afghanistan and the perception, which I think is slightly erroneous, but the perception that the U.S. is pulling back from the region altogether. Some commentators are saying, well, local regional leaders are beginning to realize they have to do it themselves. Well, alhamdulillah, I mean, that's great. Fine. And you know, I think it works better if regional leaders can work out their cultural differences, their political differences. If regional leaders can work things out together without Uncle Sam or the EU or somebody, imposing their presence. I think sometimes when there's an outside presence like the EU or the United States, it actually causes some of the nations to act out. And so America's not leaving the region. You know, we could go on about that for an hour. It's not leaving the region. It still has lots of military presence as well as political, economic, social. But to the extent that what happened in Afghanistan has caused regional leaders to think about the need for self-initiated dialogue and problem solving, I think that's great. And the problems really, that divide the regional states, with maybe one exception, which is Iran, they're not that great. We saw with the Abraham Accords that even Israel and Arab states broadly can make progress. The exception is Iran, because to date, Iranian leaders have had this sort of Shia expansionist manifesto, manifest destiny, if I can steal the phrase from American history, of Shia activity in the region. That's still there. And until Shia leaders, not just Iranian Shia leaders, but Shia leaders throughout the region and Sunni leaders can get over that. And I know that's a lot to ask. It's been going on for 1,000 years. But that remains kind of the basic instability that's left in the region. We've gotten over the Arab-Israeli instability. Well, we've gotten over, I think, some of the American activity in the region against terrorist groups and rogue nations. And the Arab Spring did get rid of some leaders that were certainly problematic. And what we're left with is this Sunni-Shia clash and the decisions of the Iranian government, particularly the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC people, to make that their raison d'etre and to profit off of it. Until they can be persuaded to change their attitude on that, that layer of instability is still there, which means on any given day, you can have a IRGC ship and an American ship or a French ship get into dust up that could expand because it's still a powder keg.
Yes. Just to comment on one thing you said, I do believe the Middle East as a region is unique and special, and all for good reason. You mentioned infighting, conflict, war, and even the concept of terrorism. There was this notion of the global war on terror, which of course was beyond just the Middle East region.
Yeah.
But how have you seen the definition of terrorism or the effects of terrorism itself shift and change in the Middle East, or our perception of it change here in the United States?
I think almost from the beginning of the use of that phrase, the global war on terrorism, I've been saying, don't say that.
Right.
And it became a mantra for a while in the Pentagon. They even called it the GWOT.
Mm-hmm.
And when I tried to point out and failed, it was, it's not global, it's not a war, and if anything, it's not a war on terrorism. It was a struggle against a couple of terrorist groups. And it largely succeeded against Al-Qaeda. It took a long time and took a lot of damage and collateral damage. It hasn't fully succeeded against ISIS, although it did roll ISIS back enormously from what it was. I think that kind of activity, whether you call it Al-Qaeda or call it ISIS or some other name, and has lots of what we now label ISIS is in fact things that predated ISIS, and probably always will be there somewhere, whether you're talking about Somalia or Nigeria or wherever. There's always going to be that kind of instability. The Philippines. The fear, of course, and we might as well just say it, the fear is with Afghanistan now in the control of the Taliban, that will again become a place where problem youth from around the Islamic world will go be indoctrinated, be trained, and then be sent back out. We all hope not. We all hope that we can, both the Afghans and the United States can learn from our mistakes in the last 20 years. If the Taliban want to be left in peace, then they have to leave others in peace. And if they don't, if they again become a sanctuary and a home for terrorists, they will again suffer, and so will we.
Yeah. So in one of my final questions here, and in keeping in mind we are at a futures forum, I'm going to return to one of the first parts of the question I asked in the beginning, which was to have you paint a picture for us of what a future Middle East could look like in 10 to 20 years. And if you could do that, taking into consideration a number of the things that we could certainly spend more time on and unpack here.
Well, we will this week.
And we will later this week, right? If you could maybe paint that picture, hopefully one to which we have learned from the last 20 years, and it's prosperous and optimistic, but if it's not, that's okay too.
Well, James, I just came back from Siena, Italy. And a great town, by the way. Highly recommend Siena, Italy. But in the great municipal palace there are two giant paintings. One is of good government, and one is of bad government. And thinking about the future of the Middle East, I think about sort of the good future and the bad future. And I suspect it won't be either one, but we can imagine what both would look like. The good future is one in which global activity, not just Middle Eastern activity, but global activity has slowed the rate of change. in the climate. And it hasn't become a runaway. And people have learned to live, to adjust to the conditions, learned how to deal better with water, more desalinization, and more controlled use of water, better, more equitable distribution of water. A world in which people have realized they don't need to fight each other quite as much in the Middle East. And this little glimmer that we're seeing now of states in the region getting over their differences has stabilized the region. And yes, there's still a US military presence, and yes, countries are still spending money on their militaries, but the sources of the reasons for fighting have largely been reduced. And it's a world in which the economies have moved rapidly out of reliance on petroleum and have spawned technology-based industries that are also led by and including a lot of women. And that the educational system has continued to become more technologically based, more STEM focused, and more gender equal. That's doable. That's all doable. And that's, it can be a world in which there's hydroponic agriculture and the region can become more self-reliant. More cities can look like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha. That's all doable. And so is reducing some of the civil war tensions and having more participatory government. I'm not saying Western-style democracy. I think that the Middle East has to establish its own form of participatory government. Now, on the other hand, the bad future. The bad future is one in which more cities have been devastated by civil war and by terrorism. And there are terrorist groups that are robust and are a factor in everyone's daily life that they have to deal with, as it has been in the past and still is in some places. It's a bad future is one in which the climate has become a runaway, and temperatures are skyrocketing and water's drying up and the desert is expanding. And people, therefore, are fleeing the region. And because of lack of water, there's fighting over water between nations and among people in a nation. All that's possible too. And conflicts between the United States and Iran, or conflicts between Shia and Sunni more generally, perhaps even a breakdown of the Abraham Accords, all of that's possible too. Now, thankfully, we never end up in one extreme or the other, but we need to look at those two extremes. We need to understand what both of them would be and how we could get there. That's what I really hope this Futures Conference focuses on, is how do we get to the good world? How do we get to the bad world? What are the metrics we need to track so that when we see one going the wrong way, we can call it out and hopefully get on top of it. Because it's within the power of the people of the Middle East to come a lot closer to the good future than to the bad. And if we hold out together, those of us outside the Middle East who are friends of the region and the people who are living there, if we hold out a clear vision of what the good future looks like, we can get closer to it.
That's great. And as my last question, do you want to share any final thoughts or advice for our forum participants, for U.S. policymakers or leaders in the Middle East of just how to get to that good future?
It begins with understanding what it looks like and working back from there. Where do we want the region to be in 10 years? What will it take to get there? What do we have to do now to get there? And We really need that list, and that's what I hope this conference will help us develop, is the list of things that we should be doing now so that that 10-year out future can be achieved.
Let me thank you so much. It was a privilege to be able to facilitate this conversation. You've obviously shared some really good insights based off of your experience and background, and I hope that our forum participants and all those that may see this going forward certainly learned something as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James.